Welcome to the Ad Hour. I'm Alyssa Kevlahan.
I'm Danielle Burke.
This is the very first time that we are recording at NORCAM Studios in North Reading. If you see me on Facebook Live, look up. It's because we're also recording this session. This session will end up being broadcast for public access television. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're the Ad Hour. The Ad Hour began in May of this year. I live with major depressive disorder, anxiety, and OCD. What I have done for the last year is blog about my experiences with mental health. And May was Mental Health Awareness Month. And what I really wanted to do was not write about it, but to do something else that would potentially be interesting and reach more people than just possibly friends, and explain what exactly mental health and mental illness are and how they correlate. I contacted Danielle. Danielle and I have known each other for almost 20 years now.
Can you believe it?
It's kind of frightening.
I know.
Danielle worked in...
I was a mental health worker supervisor at an inpatient psych facility. So basically all the patients that kind of get sent to a hospital for evaluation for usually a minimum of 72 hours. So I saw all different kinds of mental illness. But I worked primarily on a women's unit, so saw a lot of PTSD, bipolar, personality disorders, and things of that nature, and depression, of course. However, I did also work on the other units from time to time, so saw a whole variety from schizophrenia to addiction and everything in between. So that is why I joined forces with Alyssa, and here we are.
People really liked it, and we thought it was going to be a 20-minute ordeal where we chatted a little bit about mental illness, what the various types are, depression being kind of the main one, or at least the one that it seems most people are aware of. And suddenly it turned into almost an hour Facebook chat, and people really liked it. And by the end of our first episode, people were saying, when's the next one? So we thought it was pretty important. If other people were as passionate about it as we were, we thought maybe this is something that needs to be discussed.
And for the viewers at home, I guess, watching the broadcast on television, we just want to reiterate that the whole purpose behind this, we started our first episode by doing it Facebook Live, and that's because we wanted to have a discussion. We think that the whole point of talking about mental illness is really getting people involved in the discussion so that everybody can learn from one another, and that includes us, because certainly once we moved beyond our first broadcast, it's been kind of like us doing a lot of research because it's things that we don't know firsthand.
And for those of you who aren't aware of Facebook Live is actually on Facebook. You can stream live, so wherever you are, like right now, we can see and talk to other people who are joining our broadcast. They are able to type in something that they want to say, and we can respond verbally. And it's a really nice interaction between others and ourselves. So it creates discussion. And so here we are.
Here we are.
So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we continue. We do this with every episode. Our first episode was on mental illness generally. Our second episode was in
PTSD.
June on PTSD. It was PTSD Awareness Month, I believe.
Yep.
So we had a whole discussion on that. And this is actually our third episode. We were not around in July, and that was just because our lives became kind of crazy. I'm the manager of Project Home Again, which is actually in Lawrence. It's a nonprofit. We help people in our community live with dignity and help them with furniture and household goods so that they can make their house a home. I have been slammed. The summer was little bananas, but that's been me, and Danielle is on her own journey as well.
I'm studying for the boards for nursing school, so that's been keeping me pretty occupied this summer. However, we're back, and we're glad to be here, and we plan to bring you this 3-part series on addiction starting right now.
So we're going to do one episode on addiction. I'm going to start looking here too because I'm noticing I'm going back and forth. This is very confusing. Addiction was supposed to be a one episode deal. However, a very good friend of mine who has an addiction came to me and said, I really think that you guys should look at this because there's far more information than you would believe, and I think that you need to do it justice. So we sat down and said, well, maybe we should do that. And we came up with 3 episodes. So August's episode today is on addiction, myths, and facts. September will be another, and October another, and we'll get into that at the end of our discussion.
That being said, let's get into it.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just noticed so because we're on Facebook Live, people can comment. And I see a comment right now. We will get to you guys as soon as we're able. Because you're far away and the text is this big, we really can only see our projection. So we'll chat as soon as we have a minute to go back and scroll through everyone's comments. Yes. So if we don't get to you, we will get to you after the broadcast, as we always do. Now, off with it.
Beginning our research on addiction, Alyssa and I kind of both felt very much out of our element. Neither one of us have an addiction, and neither of us know anybody directly in our immediate families or like our close friends or anything like that have divulged that information to us. So we felt like in order to do this justice, we reached out and spoke to a bunch of different people, and we started doing our own private research. In that, we found that the main theme, as with many other mental illnesses, is that the biggest block, I guess, for people to get help for addiction is the stigma, of course. It's always there with all mental illnesses. So how do we begin breaking that stigma down? So we decided we wanted to dispel some myths about addiction and kind of talk about what it is. So let's start with what addiction is. The definition of addiction is it is a medical condition characterized by compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite adverse consequences. So most people think, when they think of addiction, they think drugs and alcohol, right? And especially with the opioid epidemic, people are thinking heroin right now. However, there are addictions to other things other than substances.
Almost anything. You have addiction to gambling, addiction to food. There are even such addictions as shopping, as, what were the other? There were a couple of other interesting ones I can't remember off the top of my head. Sex addiction is another. There were a few others that I was actually really surprised would be considered addictions, but it just goes to show that there's so much that we don't know about it that we can learn.
Exactly.
So there's a difference, however, when we discuss addiction, there's a difference between substance abuse and dependency. So substance abuse is as defined by the excessive use or misuse of a drug beyond its intended purpose or prescription. So it shows that if you have anything prescribed to you, it could even just be a simple drink at a bar, you are abusing the substance if you have far more than your body thinks it should.
But to be clear, that does not mean that it is an addiction.
Right.
That is abuse. Okay?
It's abuse.
And then dependency is develops when the brain's neurons adapt to repeated drug exposure and only function normally in the presence of the drug. So this is when people automatically think that addiction is to a substance because the substance, you need more and more of it in order to get the same high from it. But this myth basically is busted because we know that there are addictions to things other than just substances. So that doesn't account for that. So there can be chemical dependency involved, but it doesn't explain why there are addictions to other things. And so that kind of goes into the difference between psychological addiction and physiological addiction. So physiologically, yes, if your neurons are, building up a tolerance and you become dependent on the substance, that's physiological. But psychological addiction is much different. So most people think automatically that dependency equals addiction. However, we know that it's only part of it, and there's many other components involved. And exactly, so that's why we can see that there's addictions to things such as gambling, and even to substances that don't create tolerance. So you can have an addiction to marijuana or LSD, and these substances, they don't build up that tolerance in your brain. So very interesting.
Yeah. And actually got us talking about something that I didn't know about, and surprisingly, a lot of my very intelligent friends did not know either. But this intelligent friend knew all about it.
I don't know how.
So the Vietnam War, there were there was an estimated 2.7 million soldiers that served in Vietnam. Of those, it was found that 40% of that 2.7 million had tried heroin. It was they were all drug tested, and 40% of them had it in their bodies. It was found that 20% of those were actually addicted to heroin. So Nixon said, what I would like to do is get everyone clean. So before they come back to the US, what we'd like to do is make sure that they do not have it in their system and they come back with a clean slate, basically. They came back, and Nixon also decided that he wanted to do a little research and see if he could learn more about the dependency or the abuse of heroin and what it did and how it affected the soldiers. Of those 20% who were addicted, who came home clean, after a full year of having professionals come back to these people and check and do lab results and all sorts of stuff and tests on them, it was discovered that only 5% of them relapsed, which meant that 95% of those people who were addicted in Vietnam came home and did not relapse after being a year sober.
So the reason that we find this very interesting, and actually the reason why this whole thing became such a big deal back then, was that people were like, this does not make sense from what we understand about addiction. We think if you're using a substance, especially one like heroin, we think is such an addictive substance, that if you're using it that frequently, you're addicted to it, you would come back from Vietnam and you would still be addicted to it, right? So this kind of brings into that question of how much is your environment actually involved in addiction, as opposed to it just being, part of who you are as a person, or, the substance that you decide to use. So we thought that was interesting to start contemplating, I guess. We realized from this also, and especially talking about it when we both talked about the whole Vietnam War thing, obviously addiction is a lot more multifactorial than people make it out to be. I see some people will write stuff on Facebook and social media, and they'll say, like, addiction's a choice, and you choose to do the substance, that there is the risk of getting addicted, and yet you do it anyway.
It's an option.
Right.
You're clearly making a really, really bad decision.
Right. But, that doesn't account for everything, because then you can see, like, these soldiers went, and they were obviously in horrific conditions in Vietnam, and they were using heroin, understandably so, something to alleviate the stress of that situation. And then they came back and they weren't using anymore. So was it really just that they had the control to use and stop, or is it something more than that?
And I actually had the honor of attending an AA meeting with a friend of mine. And what I found really interesting was, in an AA meeting and in what they call the Big Book, which is basically it's like what they go by, it's their Bible. And it's the whole program from start to finish, and a lot of literature as well. And it mentioned that the problem is not the addiction. Addiction's not the issue. Addiction is the solution. So people are using addiction as a way to cope or to live or to use it as an outlet for other things in their life that are truly causing the stress and the harm. That's not the actual problem. And that was discussed a lot at the AA meeting. It was really interesting. And I'll talk more about the AA meeting in our next episode. But for what we're doing right now, we're going to get right into some of the myths and busting them. And actually, I'm going to stop for just a second because there is a comment that I can see, and it's kind of a nice segue. Excuse me, I am covered over. Lynette says, environmental aspects are huge in addiction. The first thing you learn in addictive counseling is eliminating people, places, and things that surround you when you're using.
Right.
Yeah, that's.
But think about how hard that is,
Right.
right? So like if somebody goes to a treatment center, and of course or jail, that's the other alternative, right? They're obviously not using because they're not being provided with the substance, and they're not around those people that are encouraging it. Well, sometimes in treatment centers they are. I've seen people use in treatment centers. However, this lost this thing. Okay, you're back. But however, the interesting thing is that, sorry, I'm losing my my microphone over here. So I lost my train of thought.
The interesting thing you were talking about, how some people use in treatment, some don't. You were talking about environment.
Yes. Anyway, I lost my train of thought.
We'll go back to it.
So yeah, okay. So do we want to jump into some of the myths, and then we can go back to some of the comments again?
Yeah, and I think at this point, I'm not sure how we would scroll back up.
It's keeping the last one on there anyway, so.
Okay, so we'll move on with, actually, let's do this. If anyone has comments or questions on Facebook Live right this second, throw it on right now. The way that we're seeing them come in is they disappear after a minute or two, so we want to make sure that while we have the time, we can get to those. And if you don't, it's totally okay. We can continue and we'll get back at the end.
I remembered my train of thought too, so this is good. Who was it? Lynette that had
Yes.
the last comment. She was talking about how you have to remove yourself from the environment so that you can get your addiction under control. But the problem is once these people leave treatment or leave jail, what do? How difficult is it to change your entire group of friends, your social circle, where you live? Those things are not easy to do, especially if you can't just like uproot your whole life. So it makes it very, very challenging to not relapse, because you'll go to these treatment centers, you may want to get better, or you're in jail and you're forced to not use, and then you leave and you go back to the same environment. And that's why I think we see people relapse so frequently, is
Right.
exactly that. So that is one of the main themes that we keep getting out of this discussion is,
And you'll hear more about it too
Yeah.
as we continue.
is the impact of environment, and not placing blame just on the individual. There's obviously a lot more to it than just that.
Right.
So
the first myth that we thought was appropriate is that addicts are bums on the street. And that's completely busted. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention state that there's a demographic that they've found that is currently using the most heroin. They are white, non-Hispanic, they're women, they're between the ages of 18 to 25, and their income is less than $20,000. This whole demographic could easily be your daughter. It could be the person living under your roof. It could be a friend's child of yours who is living under your friend's roof. It could be your college kid who is living on campus in a dorm. It could really be any woman. And so when we think about that, I didn't immediately think of someone who was on the street. I immediately thought of a friend of mine, or a cousin, one of my cousins who is in college, and she's just living her life, and she fits that completely because she's not working right now. So she couldn't be making more than $20 a year. She's between the ages of 18 to 25. She's white. She's a woman.
And I think the other thing that led to us busting this myth, obviously, is that when we asked for feedback from people and we said, we're going to do these episodes on addiction, please feel free to let us know if you have stories. And obviously I would never divulge who has shared stories with us, but we were receiving emails, texts, Facebook messages from people, and every single time we're blown away because it's people that you quote unquote wouldn't expect that they have addiction in their family, or they've been friends with somebody who has addiction, or they've had addiction themselves. And it's been a real eye-opener for us, especially since, as I said in the beginning, neither one of us have addiction ourselves, and we don't know anybody in our immediate families that do. So it's not something that either of us have dealt with like firsthand. And getting these stories kind of just reiterated that whole thing that that image that you think of an addict, of just this homeless person panhandling for cash so that they can go buy some booze or buy drugs, that's not the whole picture. And we're definitely hearing more and more of that, which is good, but I really just want to reiterate that.
And I actually, last night, when I was kind of organizing our final thoughts, 2 people got in touch with me. One of them said that they were an addict, and the other said that they had family that were. And of those 2 people, it absolutely blew my mind, because from outside looking in, how would I ever know? And that's really what it is. When you think of an addict, you might think of someone on the street, but if you asked around your friends and family, your perception of that might change.
And we'll have more info on that too when we do our next episode on treatment, because Alyssa did attend an AA meeting, and obviously we can't say any specifics about who was there. It is anonymous, but it was kind of just an eye-opening experience of the diversity of the people that she saw in attendance.
I can say that the person that invited me to go had said, as people were kind of walking in, not pointing them out, but just kind of generally saying, this person is a lawyer, that person is a medical doctor, this person is a librarian, that person works at a chain restaurant, whatever it was. And every single time that I heard people's stories of who they were and where they came from, I was almost upset at myself for even having any kind of judgment in the beginning, because I totally did. But the more that I learn about it and the more that I understand who the addict is, it's heartbreaking to me that there's such a stigma around it, because they're not people on the street. They're just not.
Right.
So the next myth is that addiction is a choice, and we just talked about this. Busted.
Yeah, obviously.
Obviously.
We're busting all the myths.
In AA, the big book that I discussed earlier explains that the alcoholic has an allergy. So the way that I saw it was, if someone has a peanut allergy or a nut allergy, for example, and they are good unless they eat that peanut, and all of a sudden they eat the peanut and their throat closes up and they break out into hives and they nearly lose their life. And this is true. A lot of people who have peanut allergies can die from having it. That's legitimately what addiction is. It is taking in the alcohol or the drug and your body reacting completely different to it than a normal person might, or a non-addict would. It is not this. There is a complete reaction, which is what an allergy really is. It's a reaction to something.
So I want to say, when Alyssa first explained this concept to me, I'm in nursing school. So when she said that the big book says that addiction is an allergy, I was like, wait a second now, because I'm thinking, are they having an anaphylactic reaction? So this is where, if you have more of a scientific brain, that's probably where you're going with this. But when she explained it to me, it kind of helps you. They're not saying that it actually is an allergy. Physiologically, it's not an allergy. It's just trying to explain it in terms so that you understand why some people can use, why some people can go out to the bars on Friday nights with their friends and drink and then not feel like they have to drink every other day of the week, and then other people can't. Some other people, the second they have one drink, they need all of the drinks.
And the same goes for drug use as well. There are some people who can use a hard drug, have no issues other than that, just use it recreationally or socially, and that's just kind of it. Yeah. And then there are addicts. So you're either what is described as I'm losing it. Keep going. I'll get back to it.
Okay. So again, we just want to.
Okay, go. You're either a hard drinker, which is someone who drinks a ton, but can choose to just stop drinking when they feel like it, and they do, and they're fine. Or you're an alcoholic, and you're someone who cannot put the bottle down. It is not something that you can physically do at all.
Right. So yeah, I mean, and again, we hear it all the time that addiction is a choice, but honestly, just stop and think for a second. Who do you think would wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I really want to be an addict. I really want to have to use a substance to feel good or better or to forget my problems. Nobody wakes up feeling that way. So it's not a choice. And I think that the way that the big book explains it, even though I got caught up in that whole allergy definition, it helps you wrap your head around the fact that there's something that we haven't been able to put our finger on yet that makes a difference between somebody who can use recreationally and someone who, as soon as they use, it just spirals downhill quickly and becomes a big issue.
Yes.
So that's why we wanted to bust that myth. We think that's a huge misconception that's out there, and I hope that we have dispelled that one.
Yeah.
So the next myth that we found is that if you get help, you'll never want to use again. What a beautiful thought, right? Like if you go to treatment, you'll obviously, like one day at a time, it'll get easier and easier and easier. And once you get like 5-10 years out, you'll feel great. And that's not the case. And I was actually surprised by this. And I knew in AA that they take the whole one day at a time thing. That's why they give out chips when you achieve like certain time frames of sobriety. But I watched this documentary with Russell Brand, and he has a known history of using heroin, and he's been sober for, I think, like 10 years, somewhere around there.
Even if you, and just as a side note, even if you don't listen to him talk about his sobriety or his recovery or addiction at all, listen to anything he has to say, because he's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, he's very funny too, and he's very smart. So in this documentary, there was one part where they had this video of him. Somebody had like an old camcorder where they had recorded him when he was using, younger. And he's sitting in a room, and he's basically in this corner, and he looks all disheveled, and he's gaunt and emaciated, and he's sitting in a corner, clearly hasn't taken care of himself, he's unshowered, and he's shooting up heroin. And he's watching this video with somebody that he's interviewing in the documentary. And I was blown away by this, because I'm watching this and I'm thinking, oh, wow, that's so sad. And it must be really hard for him to watch himself using. His response was, he said, you know what? I have all this money. I'm in movies. I have these nice clothes. I'm here doing this documentary. And still, I watch this video and I wish I was him. And I was blown away by that, because it made me realize that's how warped their perception gets, and that it's so pervasive and it lasts for such a long time, possibly forever. You know, he's maybe 10 years out from his addiction, and he still can watch a video, knowing what he knows now, knowing that he's made all these steps and done the right thing for his life, but he can still watch that video of himself using and say that he wishes that he were him. You're covering the camera.
Sorry. I'm reading a comment.
So I think that is an important takeaway for addiction as well, is just to remember that it's so easy to see somebody that may appear high functioning.
Right.
So not everybody's the heroin addict who's sitting in a room by themselves, not taking care of themselves, right? You know, like people will go to work and then they drink the rest of the time. And that's not healthy either. But it's just important to remember that they have this, there's something more to it than just that compulsion to use, you know, like it becomes bigger than them, and it's something that they have to deal with every single day for the rest of their lives, which is exactly why AA does it the way they do. And I know we keep bringing AA up, it's just because we haven't finished our research yet on the treatments. So that's the only one we've gone into. I do not want to be promoting only one thing, because I do not believe in one size fits all, just to be clear. We're just using that because that's the evidence that we have at this point in our research.
Right.
Okay. Good. Glad that we got that out there. Okay, so do you want to do the next one?
Yeah. So the next myth is if you have an addiction, you are self-destructive. And that's also kind of not true at all. Addictions are, so where did we, this was a book that you have.
Yeah. The Heart of Addiction.
Thank you. I couldn't see it.
I took this class on addiction in my undergrad, so at Suffolk University, go Rams. And so it's pretty outdated, but like we did look through the book, and there were definitely some parts of it, some quotes in there that I just really, really stood out to me. So,
there were some we were really interested in.
Yeah.
So the first was, in quote, addictions are an attempt to preserve control over your feelings and your life, and respond assertively to helplessness. When I can say from my personal experience with major depressive disorder, when you are at your lowest low and you're feeling horrible and your life is spiraling and nothing is right and it's not what you thought that your life would look like, having an outlet of some kind is much easier to focus on and have control over than anything else in your life. If I know that I've lost my job and my husband wants to leave me and my life is in shambles and every day I feel like attempting suicide, whatever the case is, if I have something else to control, at least I can control something else. There's something in my life that I can grab onto and have a say in how that looks. So when you look at addiction, yes, being an addict looks destructive, and it is, but it's a way to control the other destruction in your life.
Right, and this is exactly why we see dual diagnosis units. We had one at the hospital I worked at, and it was supposed to be specifically for people that were acutely struggling with their addiction, but then have some other form of mental illness as well. So multiple diagnoses going on. And the thing is that...
And multiple diagnoses like,
so they could have schizophrenia and be addicted to alcohol, or they could be bipolar and they could be a heroin addict, those sorts of things. The important thing, though, is that in addition to we had just one unit in our hospital that was coined dual diagnosis, but every single unit in the hospital, there was 4, they all had, majority of the patients had some kind of substance abuse and or addiction in addition to their mental illness. So that's an interesting thing to think about, right? So it kind of makes sense that if you're struggling with mental illness or things in your life and you end up using a substance that either numbs you or makes you feel good temporarily, you stop thinking about the consequences of that because it's making you feel good in that moment. And it makes it easier to take things moment by moment, rather than thinking about, oh my gosh, the last 10 years of my life have been a disaster. How do I fix that? It's so much easier to just use this drug and just, this will make me feel good right now, and that's what matters. And then that becomes the whole perception, and it becomes at every single moment going forward, which is why it becomes such a frustrating illness to work with.
And I actually asked my friend who is an alcoholic. You're hearing that, right?
We have
Sorry.
trumpets going on.
There's like music class going on somewhere. I asked my friend and I said, you know, I know that people here or I'm trying to be serious and ignore the choir that is happening.
It's beautiful.
Can you hear that, you guys? It's really funny. I asked my friend, do a lot of people who have an addiction or alcoholism, do they have something else as well? And the majority of people who are getting help that she is aware of is yes. A lot of people are suffering from depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety, OCD, PTSD. So there's a lot that it's not a side effect, but it's definitely a way for the illness to be contained, I guess, is
Right.
just to grab onto.
Right, yeah. So, the next myth, which is actually our last myth, we do have more that we're going to discuss in the next episode, but the last one that we thought was very important to address is that people with addictions have an addictive personality. This is something we've heard quite a bit of. Somebody close to me actually said something similar to me randomly, like we were talking about this topic being our next topic, and the person said, oh yeah, well, I heard, you know, people used to tell me I have an addictive personality. And I was like,
Danielle almost lost her mind.
I had no idea. But it's an interesting concept, and the reason we want to bust this myth is because I think that it really adds to the stigma of addiction. And here's why. It's important to remember that people with addictions have all different types of personalities. So you can't say that you have an addictive personality, because a personality is a really big part of who you are, and it's pervasive. You know, it's part of everything that you do, decisions you make, moods you have, things like that. So to say that it's part of your personality really kind of says that it's just one type of person that can be an addict. And that's definitely not true. Hence why our first myth was that addicts are just bums on the street.
Yes.
No, they're not. It can be anyone from any demographic, any age group, any gender, any racial group. And also the reason why we wanted to kind of bust this myth was that we don't want people to think that addicts are so different from everyone else that they need to be this like separate group of people. I don't think that's a great way to address the problem. I don't think that's a great way to get people to feel like they're accepted enough to get help.
It's another way to stigmatize them.
Right.
And it's a very easy way of putting them in a corner and saying, those are the types of people that you don't want to be around, or those are the types of people that we're not going to learn about or deal with because they're a certain person. And that's completely untrue. Imagine, for instance, if it were me and someone said, oh, you have a very depressive personality. If everyone who has met me in my life would say, no way. Like, Alyssa is a happy, bubbly, social, fun, outgoing person. There's no way that she's depressive. But I do deal with depression in the same sort of sense that an addict does have an addiction, but they themselves are not addictive people. That's not who they are. It's part of who they are.
Right. Their addiction does not define them, just like any other mental illness does not define somebody. And so by saying that it's their personality, in a way that's saying that that's what defines them. Like, that's your personality. And
Right.
also a personality is something that's very difficult to change. So it kind of gives that notion that, like, it's untreatable because it's just part of who you are. Sorry, you know, you use and you can't handle it. Sorry, that's just part of who you are. I don't think that's a great way to approach the idea of
Yes.
getting people into treatment, since the number one reason that people don't get help is because of the stigma. So, yeah.
And the only thing I have to say too is that you will hear, like at an AA meeting, someone who says, For instance, my name is Alyssa and I am an addict. It doesn't mean that I am entirely an addict. It means that my name is Alyssa and I am recognizing that what I'm struggling with is addiction.
Right.
There's a difference.
Right. So, in our research, we then...
We're so smart.
So that's the last of our myths. But the main theme of our whole talk today, again, we keep coming back to this concept of the impact of environment.
Yes.
And kind of moving away from saying that an addiction is, part of who the person is, part of their personality, it's their choice to do. All of those factors are involved in this research study that we heard about in a TED Talk by, I hope that I'm saying his name right, but I can't guarantee, Johann Hari, and it's titled, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction is Wrong.
And everything that we've referenced, we'll make sure that we post on this thread after, but for now, we'll go with it.
So he talks about this research study called Rat Park. And if any of you have watched this TED Talk, I'm sure you heard about this. This was the first time I had heard about this research study, and I thought this was
me too. It was so cool.
Impactful and so cool.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Basically, just to give a gist of what the study was, is they took some lab rats and they put them in their usual little lab rat cage, which had nothing in it except the rat and a water bottle that had water laced with cocaine. Okay.
And a regular water bottle.
And
there were two.
That's right. And a regular water bottle.
So in this cage is the rat, a water bottle that had H2O, and a water bottle that had H2O and heroin. Cocaine.
And so
Sorry.
They significantly in those situations, pretty much all of the rats ended up drinking the cocaine water. And then what they did was they changed the study up a little and they built this awesome rat park where they had a bunch of rats in it together so that they could be friends, they could play, they could mate.
They
had
toys,
they had all kinds
things
of food,
to chew on.
And they still had the water bottle with regular water and the water bottle laced with cocaine. And in this different setting, the rats hardly ever even touched the cocaine water, let alone overdose on it. And so what they realized was the rates were so drastically different between the two scenarios that there was something to be said for it. And this brings us to our overall theme for this whole talk, which is that what Johann Hari says in his TED Talk is he says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And that study perfectly sums that up because, of course, if a rat is sitting alone, or a person, okay, nothing to do, no spark in their life, they have nothing to really live for, they don't have friends, they don't have lover, they don't have good food.
Nothing to learn.
Yeah, fun games, things to learn. They use the drug, right? Because that's what makes them feel good. But then in this other situation where they have all these other alternatives that are equally or even more rewarding.
Friends to play with, things to do, places to go, people to see.
They end up not using it. So honestly, that really did change my whole perspective on addiction too.
Yeah, mine
into
too.
Thinking that there's a lot more involved with the environment that you're in and the surroundings that you have.
And the encouragement and support that you do or don't have.
Right. Which is why even earlier, somebody had commented and said that you learn that when you're training to become a therapist is that you have to remove them from their situation in order to help get them better. And that's absolutely true because clearly these addictions are stemming from something to do with their environment, and I'm not saying that it doesn't have anything to do with the person at all. I'm just saying that we need to start to change the way we think about it.
We discussed earlier that addiction is it's multifaceted, and there are multiple reasons why an addict is an addict. And part of it we believe, and the research supports, is that the lack of connection in someone's life can help to lead down the path of addiction. Doesn't necessarily cause it entirely, but it's definitely a huge factor.
Right. And so even if on the surface, so like in that study, you think, well, yeah, of course, like you can see that this one rat is by himself and has nothing to do. So it's blatantly obvious why he would choose the cocaine water versus the rats in Rat Park.
Right.
But in human life, it's different, right? Because on the surface, you might look at somebody's life from the outside and think that they have all these wonderful things. They have friends, they have, a significant other, and they have good support systems. But you don't know how they feel about their environment. And so that's probably a bigger part of it, is whether or not you are internalizing the support that you may have in your life, and you're actually feeling that support is different than somebody on the outside seeing that you have friends and family that are around you. So I think that kind of explains why we see addiction in all different types of people, and that's exactly why it's not just the bum on the street. That's the obvious one that we all would see and be like, okay, that makes sense. He doesn't have anywhere to live, so what else is he going to do, But what about those people that are using that do have homes and families and lives?
And what we'll explain more in a minute too, but our second episode next month in September will completely cover the addict, who they are, recovery and sobriety. So we're only touching on who they are as people. We're really excited to get farther into the stories, the personal stories, and experiences that we'll share with you. So at this point, we have come to a close.
Yes.
So we would love to hear if anyone on Facebook Live has something to say or ask. We would love to hear questions or comments. And we know that there's about a 20-second lag time between you typing in your comment and us seeing it. So we'll give it like a minute or so.
Sure.
But in the meantime, I'll tell you a little bit about the next couple of episodes. So addiction will continue. Next month in September, we will send out dates of when it will air. We know it will be towards the end of September, and that will be on the Addict Sobriety and Recovery. It will be live on our Ad Hour page again, and all of the information that we have will get to you as soon as we have it. And then in October is the last installment of Addiction, and it will be the friends, family, and professionals. So we're going to have stories, and hopefully next month and in October we'll have a couple of people with us, guest hosts, who will be brave enough to share their stories with the world, or their personal experiences, or people that they are family or friends with. We're also hoping for professionals, so someone who might work in a treatment facility, in a halfway house, as a medical doctor who's done research. We would love to have those people as well. And there are some comments coming in.
Carrie just said that she's hiring us for Stride into the Light. So
we'll be there.
Yeah. Our friend Carrie, she actually hosts and she organizes a 5K race in Methuen, because that's where we grew up. And it's to raise awareness for mental illness as well.
It's generally in the spring. If I recall, it was in April.
Yep. Last year I ran it, or this year I ran it. So next year I guess Carrie wants us to do a little part for the Ad Hour. So
we'll be live in Methuen.
Live in Methuen. Yay, so exciting. So again, we want to remind people that, you can always comment after the fact, after you watch the videos, and we'd love to respond to you. The feedback is really the biggest part of this for us.
It's the only way that we're able to keep moving forward.
Yep, and really. So we have received some great messages so far, because we asked for people to kind of give us some stories that they may have, if they're willing to share about their personal experience with addiction or with family, friends with addiction. Mm-hmm. But we are putting that out there again. We want as many stories as we can get, because we feel like the wider variety that we have, the bigger the picture that we have about what addiction is and what we can actually do to break the stigma,
Right.
make it easier for people to feel like they can go get help, and just kind of try to wrap our heads around it.
And it makes a humongous impact. And I'll tell you that our last episode was on PTSD in June. And a friend of mine allowed me to share a nice paragraph of their experiences as a soldier and as someone who's living with PTSD. And that resonated so hugely with us and with our listeners that it blew my mind how many people were commenting to us.
Yeah.
Emails, messages, texts. There were people that called me and said, I can't believe that person felt strongly enough to say something and be brave enough to do that. It was massive. So we know that the more people we can talk to who are brave enough and confident enough to share their stories and feel okay enough to let others know their experiences, the more that we can make an impact with it. Part of addiction is that we're only seeing the bum on the street. So if we can show you that there are people just like you and just like me, it makes a big difference.
Right, and I think that one of the things that I really learned from, I mean, this is only our third episode, but over the course of this is that we really, each person, not just Alyssa and I, but each person that shares their story with us or reaches out to us about the ad hour, whatever topic we're doing, it does make an impact to reduce the stigma. And you may not think that it is because you may think, you know, I'm just one person, what can I do? But the fact is that this is the first time we're trying to get it so that our community at large feels comfortable having these conversations and kind of just hears us out. And you don't have to agree with everything we say, obviously.
At all. That's fine.
We're kind of just starting from scratch too. We're trying to learn, and that's basically the whole thing, is we want to take people along this journey with us, this
Right.
whole learning process, because that's what it is. Nobody can sit there and say they know exactly what addiction is, what we can do to fix it, because if they did, it wouldn't be an issue, right? It wouldn't be an issue. And
Problems would be solved.
it's been around since the beginning of time, really. So what we have to do is figure out how we can figure out what is the issue now in modern times and how we can just slowly break that stigma down by having these conversations.
Right. And the more that we talk about it, the more that we can say to someone, it's okay, I'm with you, we'll do this together. And it's that support and that connection that helps people get the help that they need to get better. I can say over the last 4 months, I've probably had 3 or 4 people off the top of my head that have contacted me and said, thank you for doing what you and Danielle do. You gave me the confidence to push my pride aside and say, I need help and I can't do this by myself. And whether it's them getting therapy or counseling or rehab, they're doing it. So if we can reach 3 or 4 people and they can realize that they're not by themselves and they're not weird or crazy because they happen to live with a mental illness, we're doing something.
Right. And so for the next episode, I had mentioned this earlier, but anybody that just joined near the end here, we did mention quite a bit about AA, because that is what we have begun our research on. But when we go more into the treatment aspects, we are going to cover more than just that. Because again, we really believe that it's not just one thing works for everyone. We
Right.
totally understand that's not where we're coming from. I think our whole theme for every single one of these talks has been really breaking it down into saying that each person is very unique and very different, and the same goes for the treatment that can work for them. We may have some good starting points, but because everyone is so individualized, we don't want to say that this one size fits all. So that being said, we plan to do a good amount of research and get some different alternatives just to get the information out there, whatever we learn. So if you have information about that, please share. And
encourage anyone you know who might have information or be confident enough that they want to share their stories with the world, because we would love to hear from you or from them. And the way that you can get in touch is, the best way is email. It's theadhour@gmail.com, theadhour@gmail.com. You can also send us a message via our Facebook page. That's totally fine. It's a little bit easier to send a straightforward email from what I've felt.
Yep. I think that's a great way, because then we both have access to it. We do keep it confidential, as you've seen. You know, we've mentioned quite a few things in this episode, but we will not say your name unless you tell us that you want us to, and that is totally fine as well. If you want us to be open about everything, you are going to dictate what we do with this, basically. So.
My comfort level of my mental illness is pretty comfortable. I'm okay with telling my whole story to the world because that's just where I'm at. A lot of people aren't, and we completely respect that, and we would never put pressure on you or your family or your friends to do the same, because not everyone is like that.
Right. And so just to wrap it up, what did Sean say? Great job. Thanks, Sean. That's Alyssa's husband. He's so nice. So we want to just,
so nice.
I just want to wrap it up just by saying that, again, because we were filming here at NORCAM, we want to thank them for having us here in their studios. And
the guys are amazing.
We're so grateful. For this opportunity, and also,
like, look at this. We have a backdrop. You can't see them, but there are like legitimate cameras that are filming us right now. It is amazing.
We look like real adults with like this beautiful living room.
We're
here.
legitimate.
Yeah.
But we couldn't do this without them. They have been so gracious and helpful and knowledgeable and encouraging.
And as soon as we know when the broadcast will be on public television, we will obviously post all about it on our Facebooks and on the @Hour Facebook, so that
shameless plug,
because we don't know yet, but we will let you know as soon as we have more information. That being said, thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you at home for watching us for the first time.
Yeah, and hi, Mom. Okay, bye guys.
Bye.